Well, good morning and welcome again. I'm Dan Danner with NFIB, and we are here this morning to talk about the impact of increasing regulations on business and jobs. For small business, nothing is more important. Regulations cost small business about a third more than their larger counterparts, or about $10,000 per employee per year. And for small businesses, they see no end in sight. And no one knows that better firsthand than our speaker this morning. As the founder of Kevin O's Deli at age 21, to more recently helping a California small business owner install a garage door, he knows and understands the struggles that small businesses face and the cost to their bottom line of regulations. There is no better advocate for small business in Congress. So please welcome House Majority Whip Kevin McCarthy.
Well, thank you all very much, and appreciate you coming out on a snowy day. I just wish it was like this in California. We can use the snow. My talk this morning, I want to talk a little briefly about the country going and what I see. America has a history of building things. We built a democracy, one of the greatest republics ever. Ukraine would not have the weekend they had this last weekend if it wasn't for America. The desire, the creation, the idea of freedom. We built the greatest military. We built incredible infrastructures. We built the Golden Gate Bridge. We built families, communities, and we built dreams. We could build the Golden Gate Bridge in 3 years, but we've taken more than a decade to try to just add an on-ramp today. That's the difference of the America we know and the setbacks that regulations bring forth. Thomas Jefferson envisioned his government which sought to restrain men from injuring one another, but which would otherwise left them free to regulate their own affairs. The question we have before Washington today is, where is that measurement? Where is that middle? Where is that bind? Well, if you look at the current statistics, GAO federal regulations, there were issued 2,605 new rules during Obama. Impact of at least 100 million per year. Based on the agency's own analysis, more than 69.8 billion in new annual costs were added during Obama's first term. That's in addition to these regulations imposed 12 billion in one-time costs. Now I want you to think back. In 2010, there were more major rules promulgated than in any other year dating back to 1997. I give you these dates, but put in your own history. We're going through a 4-year recovery, and we're adding on the most regulation that we've had. What does that do? Of course, each year increment new regulations comes on top of other rules that are already in effect. Using the 2010 Small Business Administration study as its basis, the Competitive Enterprise Institute calculated that the total regulatory burden exceeded $1.8 trillion in 2012. $1.8 trillion. That's greater than all the annual economic activity in Canada, Mexico, or India. So you question, will we come out of this recovery? Now, being from California, I think I feel it more than anybody else, because I have a state that compounds it on the other. The restraints that we see hold back the ability for growth. And the goal here is to unshackle. So what is the Congress doing about it? Well, this week the House has a package of regulatory reform bills that represent the most ambitious attempt to fix our regulatory process in over 60 years. The values represented in these bills are timeless and widely spread. Transparency, accountability, and rationality. In my home state, infrastructure and energy projects are continually held up or shut down because of sue and settle. We have a package of bills. One happens to be dealing with sue and settle. And next week, we'll tackle the most onerous regulation ever proposed by the EPA, the new Source Performance Standard Rule for future power plants. If you look at America and you look at the map, where has growth been? From North Dakota on down to Texas. And what has that been? That's been on private land. That's been on energy. And what does it mean with energy itself? Well, it means manufacturing jobs can come back because of the cost of where it's going. And when you think of America and you want to build jobs, if you took that energy, you took the lower cost, you made value added where you created a product, and then you sold it overseas, that's a fundamental shift and a fundamental change of growth. I live in a place in California of Kern County. We have 3 billion barrel fields. We are an oil community, an agriculture community, and an aerospace. Richard Branson wants to take you to space. They build it in my community of Mojave. Agriculture is very big. I have 2 families that grow 80% of all the carrots in the country. You ever eat a baby carrot? Yeah, there's no such thing. They're big carrots. We chop them, and we charge you more. Energy, been around for 100 years, the fields. But every week that I get on the plane to fly back to D.C., I go through Denver. There's 20 people on my plane going to North Dakota to work. You've been to North Dakota? Don't go during winter, but if you go to North Dakota, you get a $1,000 signing bonus to work at fast food. There's not one foreclosed home. Unemployment's low. But we've got a government now that wants to regulate greater and stop the growth. That's the challenge what we have during a time of where we move. The question is, where will we be 30 to 40, 50 years from now? Now look, I did not support the president. He wasn't my choice. But I support the concept of our country. I celebrate the idea of inaugural. And when I sat there and I listened to the president use the words of Lincoln, that he was a Democrat, but he believed in Lincoln's words that government should not do more than what the person could do for themselves, I sat and I pondered for a moment. If Abraham Lincoln was alive today, what would be the advice that he'd give this president? What would he look to at a time that he built during a Civil War? The first advice I thought that Abraham Lincoln would give to this president was, believe in the exceptionalism of America. That America is exceptional and should lead the way. And there's no better way to show that is when in the Gettysburg Address. Remember what Lincoln wrote? Our forefathers brought forth a new nation, dedicated to the prosperity that all men are created equal. And if we fail, the government for the people, by the people, of the people, shall perish from the face of the earth. He didn't say if we failed, Europe will do it, Mexico would do it, or somebody else. He said if we failed. When I watched this weekend, and I watched Ukraine, and I watched the individuals rise up, would they have done that if America hadn't shown the way? The idea of the Berlin Wall coming down. I want moving moments in my life. Tiananmen Square, an individual standing up before a tank. It's the idea of freedom and liberty. The second advice I think Lincoln would tell him is don't look back. Think about it. When Lincoln was inaugurated, it was March 1861. 7 states have already left the Union. I've read a lot about Lincoln. I've asked a lot of people about him. I never once heard him say it was James Buchanan's fault. Never once. The next advice I think he would give him is don't govern for the next election. By this I mean you watch Lincoln going into the next election. You had McClellan, you had the Democrats, all wanting to negotiate peace on a civil war. He didn't. He charged ahead. The nation was tired of war. And what happened? He didn't do it for the sake. He thought, I might lose the election. So what? I want the nation to grow. I want the nation to be together. He didn't say, I got to deal with the Keystone Pipeline after the election. It's a tough election vote. The next advice I think he would give, don't put off for the next generation. Nothing more telling, unbelievable of our forefathers, creation of this country. They put off the question of slavery. And no one understood it more than Lincoln. That if you've put off for the next generation what you should do today, what does that do for your children and your grandchildren? No more than the hundreds of thousands of grandchildren of the forefathers had to die to answer the question of slavery. So the question today is, what will America look like 30 to 50 years from now? Not based in a political nature, but based in an American nature. That you've had 100 years, a century of American growth. So I simply say this is what we should focus on. Today, Camp will unveil tax reform. We want an America that has the ability to grow. Second thing I should do, we should have regulation reform, not more of it. Too much duplication. Government of agencies that have built the idea that want to eliminate from risk. When you eliminate risk, you eliminate growth. You want to measure how much risk, but with more risk, you get a little greater growth. For that same reason, at 19 years old, I took all the wealth I had, I invested in myself in a deli. I don't know if you've ever heard the story. I grew up in a family of all Democrats. My father worked in a bowling alley, got a job as a firefighter, and moved furniture on his day off, so we had enough. I got out of high school and I didn't apply myself. I couldn't get an academic scholarship. I couldn't get an athletic scholarship, even though I thought I should have. I went to junior college. I worked at a summer job. I saved my money. I met a guy that owned a liquor store but had a car dealer's license. You figure out how I met him when I'm 18, okay? And I talked him into taking me to the LA car auction so I could buy and sell cars and put my way through college. I found out later that was illegal, but I was being an entrepreneur. I stopped off at a grocery store on a Friday night because I was going to visit some friends at San Diego State in California, just started the lottery, and I bought a ticket and I won the lottery. 1985, put yourself in my place. You're 19, it's a Friday night, you just won $5,000 and you're 10 minutes away from Tijuana. You know what I did with that money? I took my folks to the nicest restaurant in town. I still remember my brother ordered dessert just to make the bill higher on me. But I took the rest of that money, almost all of it, and I invested in one stock. Because I believed in myself, I believed in taking risk. And I literally measured a greater risk, because with a greater risk, I got a greater return. If I failed, I didn't expect government to bail me out, but if I succeeded, I didn't expect government to take it all. You know what? I did all right. At the end of that semester, I said, you know what? I'm not going to go back to school. I took the rest of my money. I wanted to go buy a franchise, but no one would give a franchise to a 19-year-old or sell one. So I created my own. It was like Subway before Subway, right? I've spent 2 years at it. I did pretty well. I now had enough money I could pay my whole way through college. So I sold my business. When I sold my business, I read the paper and it said, be a summer intern in Washington, D.C. with my local congressman. And I thought, what a lucky guy he would be to have me, right? So I applied and he turned me down. But today you come to breakfast to listen to a congressman for a seat that I couldn't get an internship for, that I continue to strive, only in America. The question is, what will the next 50 years be? Tax reform, government regulation reform, energy policy. We become energy independent, all from North America. You go from Canada all the way down to Mexico. And then education reform. I believe that is a formation that the next century is ours. My kids are not going to compete with your kids. Our kids are going to compete with India and China. The question will be, will we continue to build that Golden Gate Bridge in 3 years, or will we have an America where we wait decades just to add an on-ramp because we'll get passed by the other countries? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Congressman. It's very important to see these things in a long-term historical perspective. We're now going to switch to the panel section of this morning's discussion. But before that, I'd like to bring up Jay Timmons, the President and CEO of NAM.
Well, thank you very much, Hugo, and thank you all for joining us today on this very snowy morning to discuss a critically important issue, and one that Congressman McCarthy laid out very, very well. The House has given a lot of attention to regulatory reform over the past few sessions of Congress, raising the profile of this issue and helping to jumpstart the discussion. And since the whip quoted one president, I thought I would as well. You know, President Ronald Reagan famously said, "A government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life that we'll ever see on this earth." And I think the same could be said of regulations. They stubbornly persist long after an administration departs office. Regulations just stick around. You know, when you think about it, they're kind of like bed bugs. They tend to quietly multiply. They're very irritating at first, but eventually they'll begin to suck the life out of their host. And they're really almost impossible to get under control. Well, thankfully, I've never had to experience bed bugs, but I have had many stories from manufacturers who tell me about the regulatory burden that they have to endure. Manufacturers and small businesses are committed to regulatory reform, and I got to tell you, I'm really pleased to be here with Dan Danner today. The NFIB is a great partner of the NAM and on many, many issues, not just regulatory reform. We're natural allies since manufacturers and small businesses face a disproportionate burden of all regulatory costs. The NAM, as many of you know, is the nation's largest industrial trade association. We represent more than 12,000 manufacturers of all sizes and sectors, from the world's largest multinationals to family businesses up and down main streets across America. I constantly hear from NAM members about the challenges they face in dealing with the regulatory system in this country. Now, while manufacturers recognize that regulation is certainly necessary in a free market economy, in recent years, the scope and complexity of the rules are making it harder to do business and compete in an ever-changing worldwide economy. Chicago White Metal Casting is a die caster and one of the members of the NAM. The company's president recently sent us a list of all the regulations with which he must comply. I have to tell you, it was mind-boggling in its complexity. He estimates that 1 out of every $5 of his company's pre-tax profit is spent on complying with a dizzying array of new regulations. And you know, it's not just about cost. Rules and regulations are often confusing as well, and sometimes they conflict. Another small manufacturer recently told me about how an inspector at his facility informed him that the fire extinguisher, one of his fire extinguishers, was affixed too low on the wall, making it difficult for employees to see. The manufacturer corrected the problem, and then another inspector came to his plant a few weeks later, and he informed him that the fire extinguisher was now too high on the wall, and it therefore violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. So by simplifying regulation, reducing overlap or even conflicting rules, and ensuring that regulations are based on sound science, we can ease the burdens placed on manufacturers and small businesses alike. That's no easy task, as we all know. Regulations have proliferated when both parties have occupied the White House. Republicans and Democrats are to blame for the 2,300 regulations that have been imposed on manufacturers in just the past 30 years. And that's according to a study by MAPI, the Manufacturers Alliance. At the same time, policymakers have sought to bring common sense to the regulatory state, to their credit. President Obama has signed executive orders seeking to enhance regulatory review and thus ease the regulatory burden on business. Other presidents have undertaken similar initiatives, but all have had little effect. Now, I happen to be one who's optimistic that we can get something done on regulatory reform. Whether you're on the philosophical left or the philosophical right or somewhere in the middle, everyone believes, and we all want, clean air, clean water, and a safe and healthy community for our families. The key is working together to create an environment where regulations or regulators are working cooperatively with those who are regulated to achieve similar goals, instead of just simply assuming an adversarial position. Now, as I said, I'm one who believes it can be done. I think it takes leadership, and the leadership starts from the top. I had the privilege of actually working for a governor who provided exactly that type of leadership and exactly that type of vision. I think you'll hear a little bit about what he did when he was in office when our panel begins. So we have to begin somewhere, and that's why I'm pleased that the House is taking up some regulatory reform measures. These are strong bills that will add transparency to the regulatory process and subject regulators to greater accountability. They'll begin to chip away at some of the challenges that businesses face when complying with federal mandates. For manufacturers, it's a question of competitiveness. Our regulatory system is broken, and I don't think there's anybody out there who would disagree with that statement. Yet even in this difficult policy environment, manufacturers are making gains. Manufacturing output has increased 18% since the end of the recession in 2009. And last year, manufacturers contributed a record $2 trillion, $2 trillion to our economy. Our manufacturing sector alone is larger than the entire economies of all but 7 countries. And manufacturing exports have reached an all-time high. Manufacturing in America is indeed making a comeback, but imagine how much stronger this comeback could be if Washington removed impediments to growth. If manufacturers could focus on making better products, on innovating, instead of spending hours figuring out which rules that they must follow and how they must comply with them. Manufacturers are indeed committed to common sense regulatory reforms that protect the health and the welfare of our environment and workers, as well as prioritize economic growth and job creation. Ladies and gentlemen, at the NAM, we believe that this can get done. And I'm now pleased to introduce the Hill's Ben Goad, who will moderate the panel discussion this morning. Ben?
See if are we all on here? Yep. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Ben Goad, staff writer for The Hill. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this snowy morning for what I think will be a very good discussion on an issue that's gotten a lot of attention both here in Washington and around the country. We have a very distinguished panel and a limited amount of time, so I'll get right to it. We'll have some questions from myself, and I'll reserve some time at the end for questions from the audience. But first, I would like to ask all of our panelists to say a few words about their view of the state of regulations in America. In the interest of time, I've asked that they all limit their comments to just 3 or 4 minutes so we can get into the discussion. And I will introduce them as we go. First off, to my left, we have Virginia's former governor and U.S. Senator and Congressman George Allen, who has observed this debate both from here in Washington and also from the state capitol in Virginia. Governor?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ben. I'm glad to be with the other panelists. I see Congressman McCurdy here as well. I think the state of regulations, from my perspective, were pretty well stated by Mr. Danner and Mr. Timmons and the congressman. Generally speaking, from what I hear from people, the state of regulations in the United States is that they're complicated, they're outdated, and they're ominous in a variety of different fields of what's going on in Washington. I sense that a lot of folks do want to have some optimism. There are examples of good regulation or regulatory reform here in Washington. I think the Shaheen-Portman bill is a prime example of energy efficiency. That makes a lot of sense. I think people on a bipartisan basis hate waste, like efficiency, and want to conserve in a logical, common sense manner. Listening to Jay talking about regulations like bed bugs is pernicious and lasting. The point is, the way to resolve that is review regulations every now and then. And I don't actually think regulations are necessarily like bed bugs because you want to kill bed bugs. Regulations are the rules of the road, the rule of law and so forth. But you want to make sure that they're practical, they make common sense, they're pragmatic in the way that the regulations are enforced. In fact, if you get a philosophy, and Congressman McCarthy brought up Thomas Jefferson. I once had Mr. Jefferson's seat in the House of Delegates. And in his 1801 inaugural address, he defined the sum of good government as a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, but otherwise leave them free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and that the government should not take from the mouths of labor the bread they have earned. I consider that still the sum of good government, which fits into this whole issue. Now, one of the things that I think that we need to look at is not just Washington, but look at the states. The states are the laboratories of innovation. I think you can get some good ideas. Jay remembers this, and I know Brian Mannix, who's here, remembers it, Miss Susan. When we came in, the EPA wanted to, this is under the Clean Air Act, and have emissions testing. Air quality in Northern Virginia, the DC area, is bad. One of the ways you do it is make sure automobile emissions are reducing the pollution. And they said that we had to put in government-run emissions inspection stations, 10 of them in Northern Virginia. That's for the millions of people that live in Northern Virginia. There would have been 500,000 inspections a year in 10 inspection stations. It was going to be a nightmare. And we were saying, we're going to put up signs saying, here's EPA's requiring this, call them. We said, let's let the private sector do it. Let them invest in the inspection, emissions inspection and testing systems. See what goes that way. And beyond that, they said, not only would they just be testing, facilities, that if a car failed, then you'd have to go take it somewhere else to get it repaired and then queue up again in the line to get it re-inspected. This ping pong ball effect, which has just been a nightmare. And they said, if you don't do it this way, we're going to take away your highway funds. And so many states were complying. We fought this and said, let's do it this way with the private sector. Fortunately, we were able to get the business community, Democrats and Republicans in Congress, as well as in the state, to say, let Virginia try it this way. And so we ended up with 300, they allowed us to do it. Their argument was, well, if Virginia does this, somebody else may want to do it this way as well. Well, let the states do it. In Virginia, we ended up with 350 emissions testing and repair facilities. I've had to go through it. We live around Mount Vernon. And it's a much more efficient, pragmatic approach to it. We do want clean air, clean land, clean environment. It's just what's the best way to do it. And so I think that the creativity and ingenuity of the states and the private sector ought to be employed as we go towards our shared goals of clean air, clean land, clean environment, and meeting those standards. And so that would be my perspective for you all, and as far as Washington is concerned as well, is do trust the states, have some pragmatism, innovate, adapt, look at new innovations, and we'll talk about this later, but that's my perspective, and I think that common sense, I know, is very rare up here, but I think there's a lot of good ideas outside of Washington.
Thanks, Governor. Hopefully we can revisit the issue of state versus federal regulations later on in the discussion. Next up, we have another alum of both chambers of Congress, Senator Blanche Lincoln. Senator Lincoln has been extremely active on the issue of regulation since leaving office. So
yes.
Go ahead, Senator.
Well, I came to Washington in 1982 as a young staffer, and then back again to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1992 as a young single woman, purely out of naivety. It didn't occur to me that I wasn't supposed to be here. But I ran for office because having been a staffer, I became completely enamored with my government. But I also saw it as a reactionary government, one that was reacting to crisis as opposed to being proactive. And I wanted to change that, and I still do. I came back to Washington, to the United States Senate with twin 2-year-olds in 1998, and which well equipped me for the Senate at the time, having twin 2-year-olds. But coming back with the prospect of being able to continue to work to build consensus, because I believe that that's where problems are solved. I'm delighted to be working with NAM and with NFIB, and certainly this panel here, most of which I have been with. Mr. Weissman and I found that we agreed on a lot more than we disagreed on in our last conversation, I believe. But the point here is, as was stated by the congressman, we are blessed with an amazing nation here, and we have an opportunity to really figure out how do we strengthen it. I left a house with twin 18-year-old boys this morning, and if there's anything I have learned about teenagers, it is that in this day and age, they are into instant gratification, and expectations. And that's where our problem lies. We have instant expectations and instant gratification in this country, and that's not how things happen. We have to work to make them happen. No one here believes we should eliminate all regulations or eliminate all agencies. And as was stated by Jay, we all want clean water and clean air and safe working conditions and communities for our families. And there are places where we come together and agree on how to get there. And as we move out from that consensus, we have our disagreements. That's a diversity that strengthens this country. But we can have a legitimate and a civil discussion about it, and we can work together. And that's what this is about. It is making sure that not only we have these discussions, but that we take action to remedy these age-old problems that the regulations, the over-regulations, the redundancy, all of those things that we see in the regulatory regime that exists, that we can fix. So I'm here as a positive optimist, still a little bit naive perhaps, but without a doubt believing that there is much that we can do. And without a doubt, the success of what we can bring means more to each and every one of us and to a nation. So I'm pleased to be a part of the panel, looking forward to the discussions on the specifics of what we can do and sharing my ideas with the rest of the panel and with you.
Terrific. Thanks, Senator. Let's move on to Susan Dudley, who is the director of the Regulatory Studies Center at GW. Susan has also served as administrator of the little-known but very influential Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Bush administration. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Ben. It really is great to be here with all the previous speakers. And I think one of the things that has come across from this is the bipartisan support for sensible regulations that actually, as Governor Allen said, provide the rules of the road. We need the rules of the road, the rules of the game, but not a constant churning of regulations, not excessive regulations. We want them to be sensible. And I think if you look at the policies, the written policies of the last 5 or more administrations, they agree on what that means when it comes to regulation. What makes for a good regulation? How do we understand what regulations' likely effects will be? And yet I think as Jay said, this is not a Republican or a Democratic problem that we see. All administrations have strayed from those core principles. So if you look at the number of economically significant regulations or the big ticket regulations, Presidents George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, and George W. Bush all issued on average over the course of their terms 45 big ticket regulations per year. President Reagan, on the other hand, it was 20. So we saw a big jump up, but then we saw it was there's always variation year by year, but if you look at across the whole terms. But I do think people's concern that we've seen more regulations over the last 5 years is substantiated by the data because President Obama has issued 55 on average per year of these economically significant regulations. I look forward to the rest of the conversation to talk about what we should do about it because I do have some thoughts on what reforms will be, but I'll stop here.
All right. So next up is Robert Weissman, who is the president of Public Citizen. That's one of the organizations that has really led the charge for stronger protections. And Rob is also the co-chair of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. Go ahead, Rob.
Thanks, Ben. I have to apologize. My voice is not doing too well today. I think my job today is to sort of offer what's in this room, but not in the broader American public, the minority viewpoint on these issues. And I really appreciate Ben agreeing that I could have a half hour to elaborate on those.
Got it, Rob.
Just to offer a little bit of balance. I do think some of the latter part of Jay's comments and all the previous speakers are really important to recognize. Regulations don't exist because bureaucrats feel like they should enhance their power. Regulations exist to advance important public policy objectives, to make our air cleaner, our food safer, our roads safer, and they've done that. So if you're going to say you think regulations are bad, or regulation, the parasite thing, I think you don't want to go there. But regulations are too far, too much. You got to also sometimes say, what's the regulation that you like? You can't agree with that principle and then oppose every actual existing regulation that's being proposed. I wanted to make 3 comments, 3 points real quickly, about cost-benefit analysis, about enforcement issues, and then a little bit about small business. The first on cost-benefit. I'm not a big proponent of cost-benefit, but I'm surprised regularly by the purported advocates of cost-benefit analysis relying not on actual costs and actual benefits and looking at regulation, but doing things like relying on anecdote, emphasizing costs but not benefits of regulation, or relying on ridiculous studies like the $1.8 trillion figure that is thoroughly discredited. And if you ever read that study, you don't need to see an analysis of why it's discredited. But if you want to go through it, email me and I'll be happy to talk to you about it. I'll actually talk to you when I have a voice. But in the meantime, I can do it by email. Susan's former office, OIRA, issues an annual study that does look at the actual costs and the actual benefits of regulations that are issued by the federal government. And those studies throughout the Bush administration, Obama administration, and so on, find every year that regulations benefits outdistance the cost by a minimum of 2 to 1, and often, depending on your calculation, up to as high as 14 to 1. So the actual regulations we issue massively pass cost-benefit test. Second point, how much, what about the issues of enforcement and over-compliance? And you will not be surprised to know that we think the problem is under-enforcement by agencies across the board. I think under-enforcement was a big part of what led to the financial crash, both the problem of non-regulation, deregulation, but also non-enforcement. You had about 5 consumer protection enforcement actions by the Federal Reserve in the 5 years leading up to the crash. If you look at OSHA, which is one of the most hated agencies in this regard, OSHA has enough inspectors, federal OSHA, to inspect each workplace once every 131 years. It's hard to see how there's a problem of over-enforcement there. Third point, in the area of small business, and this is a serious point, and I hope we can have some conversation about this with NFIB and others here. It seems to me that there are huge interests of small business, not just in talking about deregulation, but in thinking creatively about regulation to deal with enhancing competition, avoiding monopolies and collusion from big business that too often get in the way of effective small business operation. For example, energy markets are insufficiently competitive. Small businesses pay too much in their electric utility bills. There's too much concentration in the telecommunications industry. The Comcast Netflix deal is a part of this story. It's going to completely undermine the ability of small entrepreneurs to launch new internet businesses. The too big to fail problem in the banking sector provides a significant, about $50 billion or more a year subsidy to large banks as against small credit institutions. And as the last one, the problem of excessive patenting and patent trolls undermining and interfering with small business innovation is a very serious one Congress keeps being on the verge of dealing with, but hasn't yet managed to grapple with sufficiently. So to me, it seems like they're actually, even from just a sort of marketplace competition point of view, as Governor Allen said, you need regulations to enforce fair market competition, and we need a lot more work in that area. So last concluding comment. Thank you, Ben, for the 25 minutes so far. We have every once in a while we get a glimpse of what it means to not have sufficiently regulated economy and environment, food safety system. So the financial crash is one of those. The chemical disaster in West Virginia recently was another, where you basically have a completely deregulated system relying on the goodwill of manufacturers who obviously didn't want to poison the water but did. I don't want to live in a world where when asked if the water is safe to drink, the governor says, it's your decision.
Thanks, Rob. And last but not least, we have Philip Howard, who is the founder of Common Good. Mr. Howard has written extensively on the subject of regulation. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Ben. Well, my main role here is to be the one person not from Washington. So all the wisdom locates over here. I haven't gone native. The Americans know that something's broken in Washington, but I think both parties are approaching the problem in a way that's not very constructive. For example, I think a sort of broad-scale demand for deregulation, for some of the reasons just mentioned by Robert, more confuse the issues than illuminate them. I think it's hard to find almost any program, regulatory program in government or social service that you would want to eliminate. You certainly wouldn't want to eliminate environmental review. You wouldn't want to eliminate special ed. You wouldn't want to eliminate health care for the elderly. You wouldn't want to eliminate worker safety laws. So all of those, I think, are valid goals. There are a few, I'll talk to you later, that I would eliminate. But most of them, 90% or more, I think you would, programs, the goals of the programs you'd want to keep. I think the left-wing defense of regulation, which is generally to say these programs advance worthwhile social goals, is also not constructive. Environmental review shouldn't take upwards of a decade, often for projects that have virtually no environmental impact on their face, like bridges that are using the same foundations and the same right-of-way. One I'm thinking of that's in its 5th year process right now. Special ed is a really important program. It shouldn't consume upwards of 25% of the total K-12 budget, with almost nothing for gifted children or pre-K education. Wasn't the intent of the law. Medicare, according to Dr. Don Berwick, because of the way it's structured, wastes upwards of $200 billion a year. No one wants to get rid of health care for the elderly, but that structure is, I would argue it's immoral. You can't waste that much money when those could be going to other public goods, saving the fish in the ocean or something else. So I believe there are structural problems with the way we've built our regulatory system. The first one, which people have alluded to, but I think should be number one on the list by a factor of 100, is we never go back and look at old laws. Congress, you could count on one hand the number of laws that have been significantly changed in the last statutes in the last 20 years. A little bit more change in the regulatory system, but not much. It's like Herbert Kaufman of Brookings once wrote an article decades ago called "Our Regulations Immortal," and the answer is pretty close. And the problem with that is not that the laws are bad; it's that every choice we make in life, how you got here this morning, whatever you're doing in life, you have to adapt constantly. You write a law, it will have unintended consequences. Nobody writing special ed thought that it should consume 20 or 25% of the total school's budget. They just wrote it in a way as an open-ended right that it sort of morphed into that. Well, somebody needs to go back and make a policy judgment. That's why we have a democracy. What's the right balance? How do we structure that? How should we allocate limited school dollars? Nobody's even asking the question. The same with environmental review. We don't want to get rid of it, but it shouldn't take a decade or longer. So we have that as a structural problem, which is we never go back and look at old laws. Exacerbating that is a recent trend, which is really in the last couple of decades, to make law as precise as possible, driven by conservatives as well as liberals. So you have 950 pages for the Volcker Rule, thousands of pages for the Affordable Care Act. The detail makes the obsolescence instantaneous. That's why Obama, there's a big complaint that Obama's not complying with the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. You couldn't possibly comply with them all. So he's just ignoring them to try to make the law work. The law was way too detailed. The Glass-Steagall Act was 34 pages. The Constitution is 16 pages. Laws that are based on goals and principles and give elected and appointed officials some room to actually take responsibility to make them work can live and grow over time. Laws that are regulations that are thousands of pages long, just are iron shackles. The problem with OSHA is way too little enforcement. Robert's absolutely right about that. But the way they regulate, which is thousands of detailed rules, actually don't address the main issue of safety, which is all about a culture of training and attitudes and a culture of a safe workplace. Lots of studies on this. So there ought to be more enforcement, but there ought to be a much more flexible law that looks at actually how safe workplaces are and sets goals for training and attitudes and finds people and tries to work with businesses to make them safer rather than going around handing out tickets because the fire extinguisher is too low or too high or whatever they do. So I think we're at a period where you can't actually prune this jungle. I think we're going to have to recodify it. There's two deads.
Thanks. So I think everyone can agree here that the rulemaking system is not working perfectly. And I wanted to sort of hit on something Mr. Howard said there, talking about the structural problems within the rulemaking system. And I wonder if the other panelists, maybe starting with either Rob or Susan, could talk about where they see flaws in the executive branch process of making a law. I'm sorry, making a regulation. Yeah.
I think what we need are more checks and balances within the executive branch, but others as well. So maybe I'll make 4 points on that. First one I'll call Article 1. And that is that the legislative branch really needs to be more accountable for the regulations. And I think there are several ways to do that. I've written about the pros and cons of the REINS Act. But I think bottom line of the REINS Act is it's a Congressional Accountability Act. Also, Congress needs an office that reviews regulations. So we have a CBO that's the equivalent of OMB, but we don't have an equivalent to OIRA. So that's my point 1. Article 2 is that the executive branch, and this is more directly related to your question, Ben, does need to do a better job of oversight. Or, actually, I shouldn't say a better job, because I do think that there is oversight, and I'm very pleased that at the continuity of that oversight over really the last 4 or 5 administrations, that President Obama has not only continued the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs responsibilities, but has, as I guess somebody mentioned, Jay, I think you mentioned, has issued new executive orders that reinforce that. But I think we do need to do a better job of analysis. I think Rob's point about it shouldn't be by anecdote, I think that's very important. But we also need, and this is getting to Philip's point, better retrospective analysis. When you mentioned the OMB's benefit cost report to Congress, that is an ex-ante estimate of what we think the effects of these regulations will be. We don't go back enough to look at what their effects really are, what's working and what's not working. So President Obama has issued an executive order on that. It's excellent. We need to put some more rigor into that and put it into practice. And that's actually one of the major initiatives of my Regulatory Studies Center this year going forward. And Article 3, the courts. They really need to be more careful about expanding how statutes are interpreted, broadening the interpretation of statutes. So, for example, the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, and a few years ago with the EPA, we're having new definitions of what constitutes a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, something that this Congress never, has not considered, and certainly the 1970 Congress never considered. So I think that's important. And that, on top of that, the deference to agencies in how they interpret the statutes. And then finally, the states, Article 4. And I'll just reiterate what Governor Allen said about that, that we really, allowing more things, a lot of things can be done at the state level, and that does reflect the diversity across the country and the experimentation that you talked about.
On regulatory review, the President has initiated a look back where he's asked agencies to go back and identify regulations that are either redundant or unnecessary, overly burdensome, and they say that they've identified billions of dollars worth. Yes, Rob, do you think that is an important exercise, a worthwhile exercise, and do you think that that makes a counterpoint to some of the criticism that we're hearing?
Yeah, let me, if I could, just offer one thing that changed previously. But It's not enough that my voice is bad. You're doing that to me too. And then I'll directly answer that. I mean, I think I agree with something that Philip was saying about the complexity of both laws and regulations, and it's a bipartisan problem. It's partly a litigious problem, but it's directly, Susan, it really runs up against what you're saying with the EPA. I mean, if you want an organic statute that's not hyper detailed and lets decisions be made, then you can't complain that an agency interprets, or a court holds that an agency must interpret a statute written 4 decades earlier in light of new information and do something about it. I mean, that's kind of the world that you're talking about. Now, OSHA, as it happens, tried to do that early in this administration, adopt a more broad, general workplace duty standard, and it was completely crushed. So that was abandoned. So, I mean, the industry did not want to go along with that idea. In terms of the specific thing about regulatory review, I mean, our criticism of regulatory review is that you've got agencies. Go ahead, Drew.
May not be you.
No, it is me. You've got agencies that. Thank you, sir. You have agencies. I mean, still not. Can you hear me? Okay, yes. You have agencies that are really under-resourced for issuing regulations, now having to divert some substantial portion of their resources to doing these reviews. And so it gets in the way of actually rulemaking. Now, in contrast to what Susan says, I think the agencies have a real problem getting rules out. And in fact, when Congress orders them to issue a rule by a mandated period of time, the administration fails overwhelmingly to come even close to those periods of time. So that's a big problem. In theory, the retrospective review is fine as long as it's an even-handed retrospective review. We should both, in the regulatory context, narrowly define as about regulation, and more generally, as Philip is talking about, how we regulate generally. We should go back and say, how's it working? And if it's not working, let's fix it. So that should mean, for example, not just that we look back at each individual rule, but we look at the chemical safety system we have and we say, you know what? We're actually not regulating almost any new chemical that comes on the market, and a lot of these turn out to be dangerous. We don't think that system is right. We need a new regulatory framework to deal with that. If we have that kind of open review, I think that's something that a lot of people would be able to unify around, including the kind of things that you're talking about, which would also look at case by case and also how the stuff interacts. Is it collectively a problem?
So then is it possible that everyone on the panel agrees that there should be a more permanent, retroactively looking mechanism in the rulemaking system? Does anyone disagree with that?
No, but you also have to know that Congress has a responsibility of oversight for the agencies that they delegate the power to set regulations. I think that's a retrospect too. I mean, the fact is we have 5-year bills because we're supposed to learn what we got right and learn what we got wrong and improve. I mean, highway bills, farm bills, education bills, all of that, and we don't do it.
Well, we don't do it on two levels. We don't do it on 2 levels. We don't do it at the level you're talking about. So Congress delegated regulation writing authority, and they ought to have some authority and ability to actually second guess the regulations, since they're the lawmaking body.
They absolutely have the responsibility of oversight.
But Congress needs to go back and look at its own laws too, and it has failed completely. I mean, it doesn't even. Nancy Pelosi was on Jon Stewart the other day, and he was asking, well, don't you have to go back and look and figure out how to, see how things really work? And she said, well, that's not my responsibility. It's just pass the laws.
Well, the example you use of special ed is perfect. I mean, we haven't reauthorized ESEA in, 12 years? I mean, it's a 5-year bill. I had special ed teachers in tears talking about the fact that, here I am to work with this child. And it wasn't the budget that was their problem. The fact was that they were required to write a portfolio, and they were spending 75% of their time putting together a portfolio on this child instead of spending time with the child. That's something that we could learn, and we could change in Congress, because we should be reauthorizing that bill. I mean,
Governor, what about that? I mean, hasn't Congress abdicated some of its authority in this area? I mean, certainly they've been unable to get a whole lot done, and some of the criticism that the administration has gone too far could be directed maybe at the Congress.
Well, you do have a constitution, and we are a representative democracy, and elected representatives of the people are supposed to make the law. So if you have a very long bill, you hold them responsible, say in this Affordable Care Act. Well, you voted for it. Oh, I didn't read that tough. There's an election every so often, and you can hold them accountable, and you compare that to the Dodd-Frank bill, where a lot of that is just left off, and there's still evolving regulations of that. And they say, oh, well, that's the SEC or some other group doing it. Let me just say a few things here. You don't want to govern by anecdotes, but anecdotes do tell you where things are wrong. The fire hydrant story, fire extinguisher story from Jay is an example. Blanche and I had the same reaction on the special ed law. When I was in the House of Delegates, represented Nelson County. It's south of Albemarle, south of Charlottesville, where the Waltons TV show was. They had a two-story high school. That special ed law forced them to put in an elevator. They didn't have any student who actually was disabled to need to go to the science lab or whatever class it was on the second floor. They said, look, and then one came in and they said, all right, we're going to switch that classroom to the main floor so we don't need to spend tens of thousands of dollars on an elevator. But they had to put in an elevator. By the time the elevator was in, the student had graduated and no other students come in. These are just the common sense, practical matters that get people interested or outraged. And there is a Danner was talking about small business. There is a disproportionate impact of these regulations on small businesses and entrepreneurs. And so that needs to be taken into account when regulations are being formulated and promulgated and acted on. I think what needs to be done is a structure, a discipline put in, and we did this, and it's leadership of the executive in Virginia or the federal government, is right when I came into office, we said we're going to analyze every single regulation in Virginia, and we're going to do it in a systematic way and determine what's the purpose of this regulation. If the purpose is still a worthwhile purpose, is there a more practical, less burdensome way of achieving that particular goal? Now, when you go through it that way, the reaction was from so many was, well, why are you doing it this way? Well, we've always done it this way. And yes, that's fine, but why do you do it this way? And they said, well, we've been doing it this way since Governor Godwin. Oh, fine, that's good, but why? But that's a mindset is we've always done it the same way. It's kind of a pack mule mentality that, this is the way it's been done. When we actually went through all of this, at the end of 4 years, 71% of the regulations in Virginia were either amended or eliminated. 41% were amended, 30% were eliminated altogether. Then Bob McDonnell came in. We completed that in 1998. Bob McDonnell came in 12 years later, and he said he was going to do this. And some of my friends said, oh, look, Bob McDonnell's copying what you're doing. Yeah, that's, like plagiarism. I said, no, he's exactly correct. Don't tell me things haven't changed in the last 10, 12 years with technologies, that you can do things more efficiently. And so there needs to be, in my view, that periodic discipline of a review of every regulation. Maybe you'd have to do it under a sunset provision on a regulation to force it. But I think that you just look at things, how much things have changed in the last 6, 10 years. And the use of the internet, tablets, look at your smartphones and all the rest. There's so many better ways of doing things than there were before. And so you still achieve that goal, but you do it in a practical, an efficient, a logical way of achieving whatever that particular purpose is. The other thing for the states when you do those regulatory reviews is that you determine the reason you have to do it this way. It's because the federal government commands it. And so that would then set up that's a good discipline to say, well, the federal government says we have to do it this way. Then you say, well, will they give us some leeway to do it more practically? And to Rob's point, though, on, say, OSHA, a lot of states are the ones, I don't know if your stats have it one way or the other, but a lot of the states, you have Virginia, OSHA, the same with mining and so forth. And so the states actually do work with the federal government and enforce those laws, and sometimes do it more practically than if you had to have a bunch of federal bureaucrats doing it. You get your state people doing it as well.
We get back real quickly to what you were talking about, the sort of the disparate impact of regulations on small businesses. This is something we've heard a a lot of complaints from various industries on the issue. I mean, particularly, I think with the Affordable Care Act and the Dodd-Frank rules, some industries have called for sort of a tiered system in which the rules apply differently to companies based on their size. I mean, on their size. I think we've seen that to an extent with, say, the employer mandate, where certain companies are affected differently because they're smaller. Is this an area where the sides on people with different perspectives on regulation can find some common ground? The idea that regulations shouldn't affect everyone the same way. Maybe, Rob, would you?
Well, I think it's correct that they generally don't. The tiering is pretty common. And I think there's another, one other thing that kind of, in all these regulatory policy debates, is important to just try to clear up between the legislative framework and the regulation. So the things that are in the Affordable Care Act, you can call them regulation in a way, but that was passed by Congress as a law. And you either like the law or you don't like the law, and I'm actually not a big supporter of the law. But it's not really, and then the agencies are charged with administering it. But to call those things regulations, by and large, seems to me to be a little bit misleading, because it's not the agency doing anything other than really carrying out what they were commanded to do. Now, Dodd-Frank also, same thing, although a lot more discretion, I think, in terms of how the agencies are moving forward, because the stuff is so broad. It's not just carrying out one basic program. And in Dodd-Frank, by and large, there's very significant tiering of requirements. And as I was referencing, there are other small business components to this besides the effect on smaller credit institutions. Though there's that too. But there's also the ability of small businesses across the country to get access to credit, and how competitive the market is. And the problem, which I think Dodd-Frank does not address sufficiently, of concentration in the market, and the too big to fail, too big to jail institutions, I think is really as much as both a public problem, it's also a small business problem.
Well, and to the other panelists, what about Rob's earlier point that small businesses in some ways rely on regulations to sort of level the playing field? When you talk about collusion, and I mean, do they need protection, or are small businesses more adversely affected than they are protected?
Yeah, I mean, if you stack up lots of well-meaning requirements that large corporations can easily accommodate, a small business cannot accommodate that. You can't have 100 forms to fill out if you're a small business without dramatically affecting your ability to do business. And there may be some tiering. I'm not an expert in financial regulation, but what I've heard about Dodd-Frank is that many of the compliance requirements are actually significantly eating into the bottom line of small banks and driving them into the arms of too big to fail banks. Yep. So exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to be. I do know something about OSHA enforcement, and again, small businesses. When somebody comes in and gives you fines for not having the MS, the material safety data sheets, for in the right place or something, that's a form of tyranny. It has nothing to do with the actual safety of the place. I mean,
you know what? Those data sheets, they didn't exist in West Virginia, and no one knew what was happening. So those are not just they're not just an empty bureaucratic requirement. It's very concrete. Where were the material safety data sheets for the West Virginia plant? They didn't exist. What was the safety consequence of those chemicals? No one knows. No one knew, and no one knows. So actually, they exist for a reason. It's not just because someone felt like, wouldn't it be fun to make a small business have to have a sheet somewhere?
Something I completely disagree with that. If there are harmful chemicals in a plant, there ought to be information that's not just on a sheet that nobody looks at, but ought to be part of a training thing that people actually affirmatively go and say there's something dangerous. Material safety data sheets, if you've ever been in one of these factories, are in a notebook about 6, 8 inches thick, filled with sheets where you can't find the really harmful stuff. So you and I bet we would agree on the need to, sort of have information about toxic materials and have both more than just having a sheet. But the way the program works is it's like a version of The Boy Crying Wolf. It ends up being lost amid sheets about things that are of marginal or no significance.
But that's the point of compliance. I mean, and we've talked about this. Enforcement is critically important to the program, But compliance is where the focus should be. And it's not just compliance on having a sheet there, but it's compliance that the workers that are there know and understand what's going on. And you can't get that if you don't have a relationship between the business and industry and the regulatory body. And that's where we're missing the connect, I think, is that, regulators want to mostly enforce, and for small businesses, without a doubt, the complexity and the predictability of these rules and regulations just have them in a tailspin in terms of what they have to meet or what they think they have to meet, and what it's going to cost them on their bottom line. So, y'all both have points there, but to solve that, you've got to have agencies that are willing to get out there and walk through the family-owned nursing home in a small town in the middle of nowhere who's having to meet all of those healthcare regulations. And some of them are obscure, whether it's a leaky faucet in the janitor's office that they get slapped with a $10,000 fine right off the bat. Instead of saying, can you fix the leak? Do you know why this is a problem? Or a dented can of peaches or whatever. I mean, I've walked through these small, family-owned businesses out there in a place where they desperately need them because nobody else is going to come out there and serve those seniors. But there's just no communication. And I just think that you've got to make sure that when you're talking about regulations and the objective of what we all want to meet, you've got to work with them on compliance. Enforcement's important, and I know, Robert, you and I've had this conversation. It is critically important, but you've got to work with them. I don't know. I just don't think that's impossible.
And as you've said, it's the sensible regulations in the first place so that the leaky faucet or the dented can of peaches isn't the same as not knowing what hazards are really there, that you need to be able to prioritize.
So, Susan,
Well, and allow them to come with some of the solutions, like the special needs teacher, or the elevator in the school. Can we use, instead of this, move this class to the downstairs instead of having to put in, is that going to meet the disability that
what's the outcome we want?
What is the outcome we want? And have that interaction, because I don't know.
Well, I
it's not
do
working
think
now.
that Jade mentioned it, and if you have a cooperative rather than an adversarial approach, I think you'll find achieving goals. Getting Philip and Robert together and figuring out, all right, you had this West Virginia chemical spill, something screwed up somehow, some way. That's when people say, well, gosh, we got regulations, why didn't this work? From every one of these disasters, what needs to be done is do an after-action review, determine what was the reason that this happened. Was it human error? Was it mechanical? Was it technical? Are there better ways of monitoring to prevent it? The same thing with some of the disasters that they hit in the Tennessee River and right now on the Dan River in Virginia. The same with the Gulf blowout. BPs, all of that doesn't mean, we're not going to have offshore drilling, we're not going to use coal, we're not going to allow chemicals to be manufactured in this country. No, they need to be done. And you talk about small businesses and high electricity bills, you outlaw coal, which they're doing right now by regulation. Everyone's electric bills are going to skyrocket if natural gas prices stay high. But the point is from those disasters, everyone ought to come together and say, all right, what's the best way to prevent this from happening again? And work in a cooperative sense rather than saying you're going to ban it, you can't do this, we're going to put so much onerous regulations that no one will want to do it in this country and we'll end up importing it from some other country rather than doing it under safe standards here in our country. And actually, I actually think if Philip and Robert were put together in a room and say, all right, how do we handle
want you to come with us, Governor.
Well, I'll have Ben be the moderator. But the point is, that people of goodwill, and this is what Jay said, if you have a cooperative approach rather than an adversarial approach, you can get things done.
But to the point too, that small business, it's difficult for them to believe that that's going to happen, because there has been so much enforcement or things that they've seen and heard that's cost an arm and a leg. It's either put them out of business or what have you. They're just paralyzed. They're paralyzed like Congress is.
But there's a bill, for example, Tammy Duckworth has a bill.
Yes,
and I think David Vitter has the companion in the Senate, and it is to I forget what it is, waive penalties for small paperwork violations by small businesses. And, it's not a major bill, but gosh darn it, if you can get something done, do it. Do it. And I think all of us, a lot of this, we're having a conversation that is pretty good up here. The problem in Washington is nothing's getting done. This is the general view of everything in Washington. And so if there's any effort, if you got a Tammy Duckworth and David Vitter agreeing on something, get it done. It may be 2%, and then celebrate it. Too much of what's being done right now in Washington is just such polarization, and nothing's getting done. And I think that if people from outside of Washington say, well, look at them. They actually have done something constructive and positive. There's a real thirst, I think, on the part of the American people for seeing positive, constructive action as opposed to just saying no constantly and nothing getting done. What they're going to pass this week in the House is good. Let's see the Senate take it up. If they don't like what the House passed, amend it. Get a conference committee. I mean, that's the way legislating and governance by consensus is supposed to operate.
There are a lot of examples of from other countries about how they handle these matters. I've written about some of them. For example, how Denmark handles special ed. It's an extremely generous, kind country, has virtually none of the problems that we have in this country. How Australia regulates nursing homes. They got rid of 1,000 rules that say, you have to have 0.09 recreational workers for every 20 employees. Literally like 1,000 or more rules. They replaced them with 31 general principles. Have a home-like setting, respect the dignity of the residents. The regulators kept their authority. They went in, but it was all prospective. So they would end up, if a nursing home was really abusing its privileges, they could close it down. But the first instinct was, let's work with the families of the residents and with the nursing homes to improve, not to give tickets. And it was all goal-oriented. But what those new forms of regulation, those and others, is they embody an understanding that effective regulation always involves humans, Robert's point, dealing with humans to meet stated public goals. There is no system, no detailed rules, no system, no constitution, no nothing that works by itself. It all depends on the humans involved, having authority, having a dialectic to make things happen. Instead, we have this very sort of rigid compliance as opposed to meeting the goals sort of system that drives everybody apart. And I think unfortunately, I think that involves rethinking the way we regulate.
So I want to open up for questions here in a minute, but want to ask just one more before we do that. Sort of on the current landscape, clearly the administration has a finite amount of time left. Jay gave a speech yesterday in Texas talking a lot about the energy initiative, climate initiative that will take a lot of, I think, the administration's resources and potentially political capital as well. Are there areas where you all expect to see a lot of action in the final years of the Obama administration, or should there be action in certain areas in the final 3 years? If we could just sort of go down the line here, starting with the governor.
Well, I think that climate policy and energy policy ought to be set by elected representatives, not by EPA, which is in effect running our energy policy. One regulatory matter that the administration may do one of these days, and maybe after the election, is approve the Keystone Pipeline. I understand how people are concerned that deriving energy from oil, shale, or tar sands is more energy intensive than traditional ways of getting oil. The reality is that those tar sands are going to be made and created regardless of whether there's a pipeline or not. And if you look at it objectively, the safest way of transporting oil is by a pipeline. All energy production and transportation is inherently risky. But if you look at the statistics, the safest way of moving it is by a pipeline. And what said, you can use rail, you can use barges,
We're
you can
using
use
rail.
trucks, and obviously we're
They're
using
railing
rail,
it to the middle of the country.
which is fun. Which the point is, it's going to still continue to be produced. So, if we want to be North American energy sufficient strategically, in fact, we can actually export possibly some that helps our balance of trade. One, by not having to import so much from hostile countries, and obviously we're importing from Canada, but it's still going to come back to the United States one way or the other. And if they can't get it to us, they're going to get it to their West Coast, and China will get every drop of it. So not approving this pipeline is not going to stop the tar sands production in Canada. That will create jobs in this country. It'll help our strategic energy independence, our competitiveness, and Canada is a wonderful neighbor and ally. And I think ultimately we'll see Mexico with some of the changes they're making and getting more private sector involvement. They're going to also get greater production of oil, which will be great for all the people in our hemisphere. So I just would hope that EPA doesn't continue, and there's a court case going on right now, and I think that EPA has gone much further than, and it's part of the Supreme Court's decision in that Massachusetts EPA case, where they from tailpipe emissions to all of a sudden CO2 being a pollutant. I think that's exceeding the Clean Air Act. I don't think the Supreme Court recognized the impact of that decision. They're going to have a chance to review that, and that may rein in EPA somewhat, and then have Congress to make the decisions on climate, so-called climate policy. But the best thing that the administration could do administratively is approve that Keystone XL pipeline.
Senator?
Well, I think that is important, and the fact that we're railing it to the middle of the country, makes so much sense that we put in the pipeline. So I hope that happens as well. But I think the president has mentioned several times in several State of the Unions the importance of reg reform. And as we look at the innovation and the opportunities with small businesses across this country and the industries that we have, the wonderful opportunity that I certainly from my state standpoint, the natural gas that's been discovered and what it means to the ability to bring manufacturing back to this country. I hope that the president, the administration, and Congress will embrace the idea of reg reform, where we look and start with the main consensus that we have, which is we want all of these other things. We want good working conditions. We want, clean air, clean water. We want, when chemical companies have regulations, we want them to be regulations that work. So I hope that the administration will follow through with encouraging Congress and working with Congress to come up with some regulatory reform that makes sense and makes us more competitive and gives us the capacity to use these incredible blessings that we have in this country to grow our economy and solve all the problems that we see. I think creating jobs and growing the economy is one of the best things we can do. And it will in turn really help our opportunity to do things better in terms of all of the things that we want to see for future generations, cleaner water, cleaner air, and all those jobs that they're going to need. I got two that are going to hit college and need some jobs. That's exactly right. So I hope and I think that the administration again has said that we want to do reg reform, or we see the need for it, and I hope they'll embrace it and work with Congress to see it happen.
What do you think, Susan?
I agree with both of what you both said. I think we're going to see a lot of regulatory activity that's statutorily driven. So the Affordable Care Act, so we'll see a lot more in the health care, a lot more in the financial markets with Dodd-Frank, more in food safety with the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then the fourth big area is environmental with no, as Governor Allen has said, no new statutory authority. We'll see a lot of activity. But I also liked what Senator Lincoln said about reg reform. And I do think there is an opportunity to do a better job of using President Obama's initiatives to look at what's really working and what's not, to really measure and see whether the regulations, we estimate what effect we think they'll have, but then we never go back to see whether we were right. What really works, because that'll help us developing new regulations as well as fixing existing ones.
Well, I have a long list of things I'd love to see the administration do, and I think they're not going to do them. So notwithstanding the Hill story, I think Susan has it exactly right. There's a set of things to do for Dodd-Frank that eventually I guess they'll manage to get to. There's the Affordable Care Act stuff. And then the single exception of the EPA rules on greenhouse gas emissions, I'm afraid there won't be any big initiatives.
Really? So the health and safety measures at labor and you think those are?
I mean, there'll be stuff. They're not going to stop. But sort of things that are going to get another front page, banner headline in the Hill, you're probably going to have to be writing on page 3. I mean, probably no.
I hope not. What about, what about the silica rule? This is something that has been sought for.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they're going to finish it. They finally, so the silica rule, given the crowd, you guys probably all know this stuff about worker exposure to silica and contracting silicosis, and a horrible disease. It's about 10 years late. So they've actually started the process now after the White House completely crushed OSHA's efforts on this for many years, the Obama White House, not the Bush White House. I expect I'll get that done. But I don't, and that's consequential. It's an important thing for public citizen, for our allies, and for workers who are exposed, but that's not at the scale, I think, that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think on reg reform, if history's any guide, all we'll see are exercises in pruning the jungle and no significant improvement in the lot, in creating flexibility and sort of common sense review of old regs. There's no, and old laws, there's no appetite in Congress that I can see, and I go around talking to senators and congressmen, for taking on any interest group that surrounds any law. And every law has an army of interest surrounding it. There is a deal to be made here. I actually think some of the Obama administration initiatives are really important. But I think they'd have a much better chance of getting them through if they would couple them with going and cleaning out cleaning out the stables. Because you could, without injuring any legitimate public goal, you could take a lot of money out of unnecessary paperwork and regs, and they create a new balance, freeing up resources for what I bet most Americans would agree important new initiatives in the environment and otherwise. But it shouldn't be a one-way ratchet, which is what it is today.
Okay, so let's move to the audience and see if anyone has any questions. It looks like we have a couple here down in front. Just if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and saying who you're with.
Hi, I'm Paul Noe. I work at the American Forest and Paper Association, but I just want to make this comment in my personal capacity as someone who formerly worked at OMB-OIRA on regulatory policy, and before that in the Senate in the mid to late 90s, the last time reg reform was cool. And just posit that, in my opinion, the fundamental problem with our regulatory system is that the complex of statutes that govern our regulatory system lack a rational framework for solving complex policy problems. In other words, there's no statutory requirement that regulations do more good than harm. There's not, in other words, a fundamental balancing of benefits and costs that's required by law. It's only done by executive order, so therefore typically regulations and regulatory reviews through OMB end in self-praise. So if we can agree that, and that's not a partisan comment, I say that in a bipartisan way. So if we can agree the goal of our regulatory system should be to ensure that regulations do more good than harm, what is wrong with Congress finally saying we're going to require, as a matter of law, that agencies balance benefits and costs, and that benefits are a justified cost, and hopefully that we maximize social well-being? And if that were a requirement that were judicially enforceable, it would not only channel agency discretion to do exactly that, it would liberate agencies to do exactly that. I actually think a lot of things you're talking about, like reviews of regulations, would never work until you fix the statutory structure, because agencies would go back through statutes that don't allow them to maximize social well-being. That was the goal, but that's not what the statutes say. So I just like all of your comments on that, including Robert.
I'll be real quick. I agree with you. and as I said that earlier, I may not have said it as eloquently as you, but I think any new regulation, you need to have public comment and determine, what the impact of this is on people, their property, their jobs, our competitiveness. And I do think that that's important to do just from the outset. And then as it goes forward, determine if there are less intrusive, less costly, more efficient, less triplicative ways of achieving whatever that particular goal may be. That's just foundational, what you said.
I agree too. I think the benefit cost is a critical component, and we have to know and determine what falls into those categories too. I mean, there's great benefits like job creation, like what it does for the economy. That shouldn't be at the sake of a health cost or anything else, but it should certainly be considered when you're talking about weighing those things. And I think it's important. It's got to be a part of.
What Blanche is saying, very simply, and what you're saying is, everyone agrees on a goal. By forcing or having that discipline of a cost-benefit analysis, you determine what is the least costly, what's the most efficient way of achieving that goal, right from the beginning. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to be that way forever. So that's why you need to have the review.
And it's accountability too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's accountability to the regulators as well as the businesses and industries. I mean, everybody has to be accountable there.
Yeah, I mean, and you've talked, Paul, about codifying, say, one of President Obama's executive orders. And I think the advantages that would do is say that Congress agrees, that the legislative branch agrees that this is an important way to view regulations and make decisions. But the other part is what you alluded to, which is that it would make it judicially reviewable, which the executive orders don't do. And it's not that the courts are going to be really very good at benefit cost analysis necessarily, but agencies they pay attention to something that they might get sued over. And so I think it would give it some more weight.
So playing my part, I will tell you that I do not think it's a good idea.
I should have gone after you.
It's not a good idea. Yeah, I know. I really should have been there. Get the last word. So, you obviously know this stuff. So as you know, it is actually done for all rules already, significant rules except for those from the independent agencies. So the first part of your statement, of course, everybody thinks the benefits, they should do more good than harm. Cost benefit is a tool, a mechanism to try to ascertain whether you're achieving that, but it's got flaws. Some of us think really deep flaws. So we're not fond of trying to codify it and make it more deeply enmeshed in the system than it already is. Example, so it doesn't apply primarily to the financial regulators who are independent agencies. They've all said in response to a proposal that they be subjected to OIRA review, that they not be, partly because they don't want to be subjected to OIRA, partly because they don't want to have to go through a formal and externally reviewable cost-benefit analysis. If you look at the financial crash, where the costs were like $10 or $20 trillion, depending on your calculation, from GAO and others, that's like infinity. So what's the risk, a percentage chance of infinity happening? How do you put that into a cost-benefit analysis? It doesn't lend itself very well to that regulatory system. And then to Susan's point, yeah, the judiciary would be horrible at reviewing cost-benefit analysis, and to my point of view, it's a terrible idea. What we've seen when they do that, as they've done without any legislative basis in the Business Roundtable case regarding SEC law, to me it's kind of, as a lawyer, I can't think of a case of greater, more objectionable judicial activism than that decision, where the court imposed a standard that doesn't exist, mocked the agency that has expertise, didn't do any analysis of its own, and actually said you have to impose a cost-benefit analysis on the proposal with de minimis cost for shareholder democracy. How does shareholder democracy lend itself to a cost-benefit analysis? So for me, not a good way to go.
Yeah, I'm more with Robert on this. It's like metrics in school testing. If all you do is look at the numbers, anybody can make up a set of numbers and give a value to something, shareholder democracy, I suppose. But but in many cases it's made up. Sometimes it's really useful. You know, the PTO, is that what it's called? PTC rules on trains, you know, they're just unbelievably expensive for a de minimis benefit. There are probably better ways of achieving it, but it's only a tool.
Just do one follow-up with you. So when you think about our presidential election system, and again, this is not a partisan question, bipartisan, does it concern you that essentially, when you think about it, you could argue, in effect, we don't really have national elections. It's about a battle over a very small number of purple states, right? And candidates from both sides make all these promises trying to having lived in a purple state, I know what it's like to get those robocalls like every day, right?
Yeah.
And they're making all these promises to you, no matter what party they are, to try to get those critical states to win. And there's almost a dynamic built in, right, where they're willing to make promises to those purple states where you could argue that promise, which, and this includes regulatory promises, might have benefits that exceed the cost for those states, or sometimes it's one state or a very small number of states. But when you think about what's the good for the nation as a whole, there might be reason to really question that. Doesn't that dynamic bother you? And isn't one way to get around that a statutory requirement that regulations have to have benefits that justify the cost? And it's political rent seeking in a sense. A statutory requirement like that would be a way to overcome that.
That's really interesting. No. No, because it's too far afield. I mean, what's the best example? The best example is like ethanol subsidies or something, right? But I mean, I can't. What's the example where there's been political rent seeking over regulation, or unless you wanted to say it's Keystone, where people don't want to, you know? No. That to me, that's too many ways apart, and and you're talking about, you know, just as a check on it, you're saying we actually want to check on the democratic process. You want cost benefit to be a check on the democratic process. Yeah, you are. I mean, so if the problem is the democratic process is flawed as our electoral system's working, let's fix that. You know, let's fix that. There are ways, right? There are proposals to do that, which are interesting or may not. But to me, to go from the fact that we have an electoral system to you think that we have too many regulations, or some of them are improper, don't meet a cost benefit. There's like, that's the butterfly effect. There's too many pieces there for me.
Good morning, Pat Cassano, GE, but speaking only for myself because I haven't vetted this idea with my management. So there's been a lot of discussion about retroactive review and cost benefit analysis, and Robert mentioned that one of the problems with cost benefit analysis is that it's too often based not on real data. There's an idea that's starting to kick around, including in forums that Susan has hosted, about planning for retrospective review. One of the problems now is that when rules are issued and statutes are issued, there's no plan for gathering the data that would be used to do a retrospective review and establishing the metrics that would be measured in that review. So what would you think about, I'd like your reaction to the idea of a very short bill that says, in essence, whenever an agency proposes a rule, they shall include the metrics that will be used to measure the success and effectiveness of the rule, and a process and a schedule for conducting retrospective reviews. And there could be something in there, there should be something in there too that says a process for collecting the information that would be needed to evaluate those metrics.
I agree.
And I think it should also talk about not only establishing metrics, but sharing information across agencies, because some agencies use totally different metrics, and then they try to, you know, combine a regulation, and they don't sync. But sharing information as well and those metrics across agencies is important.
There's a simple principle. I learned this from the former president of George Mason University. We're trying to figure out how can we measure what universities are doing or public schools are doing. And he said, what gets measured gets better. If you don't have measurement, no one watches a basketball game wondering, gee, I wonder, you know, I think we got 82 points. No, it's only 76. No, there's a scoreboard. And you do have to have measurement. And you can measurement in a variety of ways. Welfare reform is how many people are leading independent, self-reliant lives. Criminal justice reforms, look at the crime rate, the rate of victims. In education, you do have to have a test. Otherwise, you just have social promotion of students. And there's, that's how you measure in education. And economic development is how many new jobs have been created, what's the investment in your state. North Dakota right now has the highest rent. Heard this on the radio driving, and the highest rents are in Williston, North Dakota. It has the lowest unemployment. It's higher than Manhattan and New York City. It's higher than San Francisco because they're going after their energy. But the point is, you do have to have a measurement, and everyone agree, okay, this is how we can measure it. That would be a tremendous way of analyzing on a current basis the efficacy or the usefulness of a regulation. The West Virginia disaster, obviously that's going to be a failure. I have no idea what the regulations are there. That's a failure, and they're going to say, all right, how are we going to change this to make this more useful? The same with what's happened on the Dan River, what's ongoing on the Dan River right now. So those are the ways that you can measure it and then have an ongoing analysis.
And to Philip's point, that metric could be how many of those employees had been trained in the actual chemicals that were being produced and had knowledge of what they were, as opposed to just a notebook that was there.
Or using, for example, sensors that are now available that weren't available 10 years ago for this. It's not just knowledge, but having some fail-safe system that alerts folks that something's been breached here. And that's the same applies for cybersecurity. If somebody's tapping in to your fiber optic lines or your copper cable lines, intercepting data, there's ways of having the right type of copper or the right type of fiber optic so that you can detect that somebody is tapping into our information.
Having suggested metrics is a useful idea, but if that's all everybody do, then all you do is the metrics, and you can easily depart from right and wrong. The far more important way of measuring how laws and regulations are working, which other countries are doing, is they give independent bodies the authority to measure how it's working. So when you have some administration writing its own report on how its own regulations work, guess what? They're going to end up often saying they work well. You get an independent body, whether it's CBO or somebody else, to actually analyze how it's working, then it's more constructive. I think there needs to be much more use of independent bodies, and then you'll start getting some really honest reviews. And again, you can use or have suggested form metrics, but I don't think they should be exclusive, because otherwise they end up being their own kind of internal universe where everybody's just trying to meet the metrics instead of the ultimate goal, worker safety.
I do think it's important, though, if the goal of the regulation is to achieve X, we ought to have a plan in place. How are we going to measure 5 years from now how well we've come towards achieving X? And I think the silica rule that you mentioned is a perfect example of that. OSHA just assumes the benefits that it'll get. It has no way of knowing whether the actions they've proposed will achieve those results or actually have unintended consequences. And it will be key to measure, if OSHA goes forward with that, it'll be key to be able to measure 5 years from now and gather the data to do that, whether they're actually achieving the outcomes.
Okay, I think maybe we have time for just one last question for the patient gentleman over there.
I'm Ron Bird. Like a number of others here, I'm a retired former regulatory bureaucrat. This is a two-part question that brings together a couple of conflicting notions that have been touched on by the panelists earlier. To what extent do you think that the proliferation of executive branch rulemaking is in part the fault of Congress for failing to resolve the difficult details and definitions of public policy in the legislative process, and instead delegating in the laws too much discretion to agencies? Or alternatively, if you do believe that it is most appropriate for Congress to write only organic statutes that leave the implementing details to the agencies, how then do you ensure principles of democracy in the rulemaking process instead of allowing it to devolve into a matter of agency autocracy?
Well, I think we are a representative democracy, and that ought to be protected. And if you want accountability for action, it's not as if you can vote out people who are in bureaucracies. They're going to be there, and that agency is going to continue, and you can argue whether they're trying to expand their realms and regimes to perpetuate that agency or not. But I do think that Congress and the legislative representatives should take greater responsibility. There are times where Congress can act on I remember when I was in the Senate, it was on this ergonomics rule and knocked that out. And I thought that was good. I was thrilled because I thought that was helpful for American jobs and competitiveness and our manufacturing here in America. Congress, and it was mentioned earlier, I can't recollect by who on the panel, but Congress can, even by an appropriation, saying that this agency cannot use these funds to do whatever Congress doesn't want them to do. So that maybe that was you, Susan, that brought it up. But there are ways that Congress can act on it. I do think, as I said earlier, energy policy ought to be set by elected representatives of the people, not unelected, unaccountable bureaucracies. And I do think Congress has abdicated that responsibility. And some of it is because they don't want to have the political fallout for making a tough decision. That's what they're elected to do. What we need is more leadership from elected representatives. If they don't agree with the other side on every issue, find a consensus of where you can get together. And I think that's what our country, we started off talking about Ronald Reagan and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, but the founding of this country, it's we the people. And it's representatives of we the people who ought to be making as many of these decisions. The implementation of it, the administration of it is by, obviously, the executive branch, but policy ought to be set by elected representatives. And people who run for election and say certain things in different states, it would really be refreshing if people would keep their promises.
It's a fine line. It's a fine line. I mean, Congress, George is right. They answer to their constituents and to those that elect them, and that is critically important. But they also get criticized for micromanaging, and it is important to know that agencies are there to implement and to bring forth the laws and see how they're implemented. But there's multiple ways that Congress can offer what their intent was. And what their expectations are for agencies in terms of implementation of law. And the last thing I would say is what I said to begin with, and that is they also have the responsibility of oversight to bring those agencies before their committees and say, are you implementing this correctly? And this is what we think, this is what we intended, why is this happening? And that's a critical part of that responsibility in Congress is the oversight.
Yeah, I think we have the worst of both worlds. It's a really good question. I think the separation of powers has turned into oatmeal. I mean, it's just oatmeal. You have the Congress telling the executive how to run itself, and you've got the executive writing laws that Congress can't, in the form of regulations that Congress can't effectively do anything about. But there's a deal to be made here too, which is you could give the agencies more flexibility if Congress got back the authority, which it doesn't have right now, to look at those delegated lawmakings and by majority vote, without presentment to the president, repeal them. The president now has the authority to undo a regulation, even a delegated regulation, but Congress supposedly, under Article 1, the lawmaking body of in the Constitution doesn't have that authority under Supreme Court rulings. And that requires, except pass a law with the president signs. And so I think if you had a constitutional amendment, which an advertisement, I have a book coming out in 6 weeks, on how we lost the authority to run a free society, called The Rule of Nobody, and I have a proposed Bill of Responsibilities, and one of them is to restore the authority of Congress or create the authority of Congress to repeal regulations under delegated lawmaking without presentment to the president. And then Congress, I think, would feel better about not passing 5,000-page laws but more general laws, because then it has some realistic chance of pulling back if the agency goes too far.
Would it be by
I want the last word now. You go next,
Would
and
that
then
be
I'll
a
get the
majority
last
vote,
word.
Philip, in your proposal?
It'd be by majority vote, yeah, of both houses.
Understood.
So, I mean, I think the questions you're raising are the inherent tensions in administrative lawmaking. And we've kind of talked about two different things. One's the relationship between the Congress and the executive. And the other is the point that Philip keeps raising about the complexity of things. I think it's important to understand, I mean, the complexity is generated by you guys. It is not generated, since this is an industry audience, it is not generated by the bureaucrats. It is generated by the lawsuits from industry, right? That, not on the legislative side, but on the rulemaking side, that's why the rules are so long, and that's why they're so complicated. And if we pass the Regulatory Accountability Act and create 65 new standards for each significant rule to pass, then the rules are going to be vastly more complicated. So you can't complain about complications and complexity and then impose standards either through legislation or through judicial challenge on the agencies that force them to be super complicated and force them to be super detailed if they're going to be able to uphold what they're doing. That's just where it comes from. I just wanted to, in the interest of trying to find common ground, not that we're really gonna, but I think, one thing the governors, and in this area of retrospective review, and it's the same thing, by the way, in your point. So, of course, in some hypothetical world, that's good. But if you're going to make that then operational, and if every single target wasn't met, there's some consequence for it, that's going to make things more complicated, too. But in the area of retrospective review, and I think the governor's point is really helpful regarding West Virginia and the other spills, we really need to take advantage of these opportunities, these crises, these disasters, to do things better. And so the review process can't just be about how we eliminate regulation, right? It has to be how we make them better and sometimes actually create new regulation. We do have a chemical safety review board that does a good job. And the best example of how we do this is in airplane safety. We haven't had crashes for a long time. But when we do, we look at them seriously. And we need to do that, I think, in a lot more areas to really look at what happened and then try to figure things out, in the spirit you're talking about, with an open mind. Sometimes maybe the regulations got in the way of being smart. Maybe technology has moved forward and we should do something. But maybe the regulations were absent. I mean, in the West Virginia case, that's pretty clear. It wasn't that the regulations were bad. There's just no regulation going on at all. And there's no enforcement of whatever exists. People don't even know what this chemical is. No one knew the chemical was being used there. No one knows what its safety consequences are. So when we look back at this in a more systemic way than my little thumbnail sketch, there's going to be a lot of things that suggest we ought to act on. But there's going to have to also be a willingness to then take the action. Otherwise, the review is an empty exercise.
Last word to Susan.
All right. Well, I'll first address your problem, or I guess it's your question. And I'll agree that Congress needs to take more responsibility. I think greater checks and balances is the key to reg reform. Right now, Congress really has the best of both worlds. They get to pass a statute that says affordable care, clean air. What constituents would not say, yes, that's what I want. But then when it actually starts to affect their constituents, oh, that's somebody else's problem. That's the way it's being implemented. So you really have the best of both worlds, and that really has to change. But I'll end on a positive, a note of agreement. I do think litigation is a serious problem. I think litigation from all directions on agencies' regulations, that is a large part of the complexity of the way that regulations are written. They're written by lawyers for lawyers rather than focusing on the outcomes that we've been talking about. And also, I'll agree with you on retrospective review. I think the importance of retrospective review is partly the burden reduction that the president has been talking about, but it is also learning what's working and what isn't, so that the next time we write a regulation or when we revise a regulation, we can make it smarter and more sensible.
Let me say one thing I hate to get into the litigation issue. The one thing to watch, and I cared about this as governor, and they should at the federal government as well. Any of these consent decrees that some of these agencies make in the judicial process really need to have a great deal of scrutiny as to what they're doing. Anytime in fact, we agreed to no consent decrees when I was governor, because that would just turn over to a federal agency the running of your hospitals, your mental health facilities, and all the rest. And so there are some times where agencies will have litigation. They don't mind losing the case and then having a consent decree of achieving what they could not have otherwise achieved legislatively or through the executive branch. So consent decrees really need to be subject to scrutiny
Terrific.
as a
And
proviso.
on that note, I think that's.
But hold on, Robert, I agree with you on patents, your comments on patents. Completely outside of the purview of this, but you are right on patents.
Can end on agreement there. Thanks everyone for coming out today. I think we had a very insightful discussion, so we couldn't have done it without all of you and all of you. So appreciate it. And as Hugo said at the beginning, the Hill will be having more of these policy discussions. So we hope to see many of you again. Thanks.
Thank you. Good job.
Good job.
Blanche, as always.
Yours was the best bet last vote because